In 1979, Iran's 2,500-year-old monarchy collapsed after months of protests, strikes, and bloodshed. But this was no ordinary revolution. What happened next wasn't just the fall of a king. It was the deliberate crafting of Iran's future, an outcome nobody saw coming, except for the man who orchestrated it all from exile. Did you know that the Shah's greatest enemy was not just Ayatollah Khomeini, but his own ego? His biggest mistake wasn't his policies. It was his belief that he could control fate with a westernized mirror of Iran's past. Little did he know, his actions were setting the stage for a far darker, more dangerous world than he ever imagined. Only 15% of our viewers have subscribed. That means 85% of you could miss our next uncovering of history's darkest secrets. Don't let the past slip away. Hit subscribe and turn on your notification so you never miss a moment of truth. After all, who wants to be the one left out when we're revealing the skeletons in history's closet? The Shah's rise, the pawn of power, 1941 to 1950s. In 1979, the Shah didn't just lose his throne. He lost his country, his vision, his control, and his life, all within a matter of months. But what if I told you his fall wasn't a simple consequence of revolution? What if he was a man blinded by power, manipulated by his own arrogance, and betrayed by those he trusted most? What if the real enemy wasn't Khomeini or the people? It was the man himself? What if the Shah's ultimate enemy was never the revolution, but his own delusion? From the moment the Shah ascended the throne in 1941, he wasn't a king. He was a puppet. Reza Shah may have been his father, but the young Mohammad Reza was never meant to rule. He was a face, a tool for foreign powers who had already decided Iran's fate long before he even sat on the peacock throne. In 1941, the Allies didn't just remove Reza Shah. They stripped Iran's independence away, ensuring that the Shah's rule was nothing more than a performance to mask foreign influence. Iran wasn't his to command. It was a prize fought over by the West. The Shah believed in his power, but in reality, he was already doomed. The Shah's greatest weapon was his belief in Western-style monarchy. What he failed to understand was that his power wasn't his to keep. By trying to modernize in the image of the West, he alienated the very soul of his nation. Was it the West that had truly betrayed him? Or was there something more insidious, something closer to home, that would bring his empire to ruin? The Shah's White Revolution, hailed as a shining promise of modernization, was nothing more than a desperate plea for legitimacy. The land reforms, the rise of women's rights, these were not the triumphs of a visionary ruler, but the desperate moves of a man trying to cling to power by any means necessary. And here's where the shock lies. These reforms didn't unify Iran. They deepened the divisions that would tear the country apart. Behind the promises of modernization, the Shah's real aim was to consolidate control and eliminate any threat to his authority. His land reforms weren't acts of progress. They were the dismantling of Iran's feudal structure. Yes, but they were also meant to eliminate the power of the clergy, whose influence had always threatened the monarchy. As the Shah sought to modernize Iran, he failed to see the growing storm within. What he thought was progress was, in reality, the seeds of his destruction being sown by his most dangerous adversary. The very force he underestimated, the Iranian clergy. Could a man who had everything in terms of power truly be blind to the threat that was brewing just beneath the surface? Khomeini wasn't simply an exiled cleric. He was a master strategist who understood that revolutions aren't won by force alone. They are won by manipulating the narrative. Khomeini's exile wasn't a setback. It was the most brilliant political move of the 20th century. From Najaf, he didn't just preach to the faithful, he orchestrated the downfall of an empire. Khomeini's influence didn't grow because of divine destiny. It grew because he knew exactly when to strike, when to appear weak, and when to let the Shah hang himself. Khomeini was the puppet master, and the Shah, in his arrogance, didn't even know he was being manipulated. Khomeini's movement wasn't born from anger. It was born from the manipulation of religious fervor and nationalistic pride. While the Shah was busy living in his palaces, Khomeini was building an army in the hearts of the people. But the most dangerous weapon Khomeini wielded was patience. Was Khomeini's return inevitable, or did he craft this revolution with more than just words? Could a man who had been exiled for years truly hold the fate of a nation in his hands? The Shah thought he could control the outcome, but in the end it was not Khomeini or the revolutionaries that defeated him. It was his own delusion. When the Shah begged for another chance on live television, what he didn't realize was that his weakness was now his greatest weapon. For Khomeini, the Shah's final moments weren't just the collapse of a regime. They were the revelation of a man who had spent years thinking he was invincible, only to discover that he was powerless in the face of a revolution he never saw coming. The Shah's plea was a desperate last attempt, but by this point the world already knew the truth. He was finished. The revolution had already won. But who would be the true victor? Was it Khomeini, or was it the power of the people themselves that brought the Shah down? When Khomeini returned to Tehran in 1979, the world saw it as the end of an era. But the truth was much darker. Khomeini didn't just lead a revolution. He set the stage for a new world order. Iran's Islamic Republic wasn't a response to Western imperialism. It was the beginning of a global ideological shift that would shake the world for decades to come. The fall of the Shah wasn't just a national event, it was the birth of a new kind of power, one that would spread far beyond the borders of Iran. And in Khomeini's theocracy, the world would witness the rise of a new threat, one that would challenge the very foundations of the West. The revolution wasn't over. It was just beginning. The world would soon realize that Khomeini's victory was just the beginning of a much larger ideological battle. And as for the Shah, his legacy would be buried in Cairo, but the revolution would live on, in the streets, in the mosques, and in the hearts of millions. The Shah's biggest mistake wasn't his policies, his alliances, or even his arrogance. It was his failure to recognize that revolutions aren't about armies. They are about people, about the hearts and minds of the masses. Khomeini didn't just defeat the Shah. He knew that to truly win, he had to make the people believe that they had already won. In the end, the Shah's fall wasn't a tragedy. It was a calculated, inevitable collapse. But the true story isn't about the Shah's demise. It's about what came after, and how that revolution still shapes the world today. The White Revolution, modernization or westernization, 1960s to 1970s. The White Revolution wasn't about saving Iran. It was about selling it to the highest bidder. It was a revolution disguised as reform, where the true winner wasn't the Iranian people. It was the Western powers pulling the strings behind the scenes. In 1941, when the Shah took power, he was already trapped, both by his own delusions of grandeur and by the foreign powers that had installed him. His father's fall was orchestrated by the Allies, but it was Mohammad Reza who had to wear the crown of a puppet. The Shah wasn't the ruler of Iran. He was the pawn in a game of global power, one he couldn't even see. What if I told you that the Shah never truly understood the game he was playing? That the men who sat next to him in the palace were the same ones who betrayed him when it suited them? The Shah wasn't the puppet master. He was the puppet, and no one told him that until it was too late. The Shah believed that his white revolution would bring prosperity to Iran. Land reforms, women's voting rights, industrialization. But what if these weren't victories at all? What if they were the tools used to bind Iran to the West, to make sure it would never truly be free? The Shah wasn't modernizing Iran. He was turning it into a Western colony under the guise of progress. Every reform he implemented, land redistribution, economic policies, was a strategy to weaken the old guard and create a new elite class loyal to him, but ultimately loyal to the West's economic and political interests. What if the reforms weren't about creating equality? What if they were about creating a society where the West had even more control over Iran's future? Could the Shah see that he wasn't freeing Iran? He was caging it? Or was he too blinded by his own ambition? The Shah's biggest mistake wasn't his failed reforms. It was trusting the West. What if I told you that every time he thought he was gaining power, he was actually sealing his own fate? The West's support was never about Iran's future. It was about controlling its resources. The White Revolution, hailed as a monumental step toward modernity, wasn't about helping the Iranian people. It was about keeping Iran as a compliant ally in the Cold War. The Shah wasn't just fighting communism. He was fighting a revolution he couldn't see because he was too busy trying to please his Western benefactors. The West never truly saw the Shah as a partner. They saw him as a tool, one that was useful until it wasn't. The moment his power became too tenuous, the West abandoned him. They had already extracted everything they needed from Iran: the oil, the support against communism, the stability for their business interests. The moment his position was in jeopardy, they let him fall. Did the Shah ever know that his best allies, the ones who claimed to have his back, would be the ones who pulled the rug out from under him? The Shah's reforms didn't bring prosperity to the masses. They deepened the inequality and resentment that had been festering for decades. The rural poor, the workers, the disenfranchised didn't benefit from his reforms. Instead, they found themselves more isolated, more impoverished, and more angry at a regime that seemed to serve only the rich and the Western-backed elite. While the Shah paraded himself as a reformer, Iran's wealth was siphoned off to multinational corporations and Western-backed elites. The very reforms that were supposed to empower the people only served to empower the few, those who could align themselves with the West. The Shah's modernization was a mirage. On the surface, it looked like progress, but in reality, it was the beginning of a deeper divide. The people who were supposed to benefit from the White Revolution were the first to turn against it. The Shah had set up a revolution, but not the one he thought he had. Could the Shah have ever fixed the damage he had done? Or was he destined to fail the moment he allowed foreign influence to dictate his policies? How could a man, with all the wealth and power at his disposal, be so blind to his own downfall? The White Revolution wasn't a victory. It was the final stroke in a long game of political and economic manipulation, one that would cost him everything. The revolution that brought Khomeini back to Iran wasn't just a political event. It was the consequence of the Shah's failure to truly understand his people, his country, and the game he was playing. The moment he aligned himself with the West too tightly, he sealed his fate. He thought he could play the West against his people, but in the end, it was his own people who rose against him, empowered by a leader who knew how to manipulate their emotions, their religious beliefs, and their anger. The Shah never knew he had already lost. When he thought he was securing Iran's future, he was only signing its death warrant. Could anything have saved him? Could he have avoided the revolution that would end the monarchy forever? The Shah's fall wasn't just the collapse of a monarchy, It was the birth of a new power dynamic that reshaped the Middle East. The revolution, led by Khomeini, was not just a political overthrow. It was the beginning of an ideological war that would challenge the West for decades. In the end, the White Revolution wasn't about modernizing Iran. It was about transforming Iran into a tool for foreign powers. But when the Shah's illusion of control shattered, the very people he sought to control took power. The Shah's greatest mistake wasn't his reforms. It was believing he could play a game where the rules were already rigged. The Ayatollah's shadow, Khomeini's strategic machinations, 1978 to 1979. The Iranian Revolution didn't happen in the streets. It happened in the minds of the oppressed. Khomeini didn't just lead a revolution. He weaponized the collective anger of a nation, biding his time while the Shah destroyed his own power. Khomeini wasn't a leader in exile. He was a strategist playing a game so precise that by the time the Shah realized what was happening, his fate was already sealed. The Shah wasn't just a puppet of foreign powers. He was the puppet of his own delusions. What the world didn't know about Iran in the 1970s is that the Shah had already lost control long before the revolution started. He believed in his own invincibility, but he never saw that his obsession with control was sowing the seeds of his destruction. From the moment he embraced Westernization, the Shah began alienating the very people who could have supported him. Iran wasn't just a nation in need of modernization. It was a society deeply rooted in history, religion, and tradition. By trying to force a Western identity on Iran, the Shah didn't just oppose tradition. He tore the fabric of Iranian society apart. The Shah believed that by bringing Iran closer to the West, he could secure his power. But what he didn't know was that every concession to foreign interests was creating a deep resentment among his own people. But what exactly was fueling this resentment? And why didn't the Shah see it coming? Khomeini didn't rise to power by chance. He didn't even rise to power in Iran. His rise was a result of strategic patience and a deep understanding of human nature. What the world didn't see was the careful cultivation of power that Khomeini mastered while in exile. Every sermon, every speech wasn't just an ideological call to arms. It was a calculated move to prepare a generation for revolution. What the Shah never realized was that Khomeini wasn't just rallying the religious base. He was building a network that spanned from intellectuals and students to the working class. Khomeini's power came from understanding that revolutions don't start in the streets. They start in the minds of the people. And Khomeini manipulated their anger, their oppression, and their thirst for justice against a regime that had ignored them for decades. Khomeini didn't need to be in Iran to lead a revolution. He just needed to turn the Shah's every failure into an opportunity. But how did Khomeini manage to do this with such precision? The Shah thought he could control his destiny by aligning with the West. What he didn't realize was that the more he tried to tighten his grip, the more he loosened his hold on Iran. The revolution wasn't about a clash of ideologies. It was about a regime that had overstayed its welcome, a government that thought it could silence its critics by force, but which instead created an unstoppable movement built on the pain of the people. Every act of suppression, every violent crackdown, every assassination attempt wasn't a sign of power. It was a sign of the Shah's deepening panic. The more he sought to control, the more he lost control. And Khomeini was there, ready to fill the vacuum of power. What Khomeini understood, that the Shah never did, was that people don't follow power. They follow promises. And the Shah's promises had become empty long ago. Could Khomeini's movement have succeeded without the Shah's repeated mistakes? Or was the Shah's fate sealed from the very beginning of his reign? When Khomeini returned to Iran in February 1979, it wasn't just a man coming back from exile. It was the culmination of years of strategy, patience, and manipulation. The world thought the revolution was won the moment Khomeini stepped onto Iranian soil. But the real question was, who was truly in control, the people or the man who had orchestrated everything from exile? Khomeini's return wasn't just symbolic, it was the realization of a movement that had already won in the hearts of the people. The Shah was the face of oppression. Khomeini was the embodiment of their vengeance. His return wasn't just about taking power. It was about fulfilling the revolution's purpose, to destroy the Shah's system completely. But Khomeini's victory didn't end with the Shah's departure. It was just the beginning of a much darker reality for Iran. What would Khomeini's rise truly mean for the future of the country? Was Khomeini's victory a return to power or a step towards something far more dangerous? Khomeini's revolution wasn't just the overthrow of a king. It was the birth of an Islamic state that would challenge the entire geopolitical order. But the true cost of the revolution wasn't just political, it was cultural, economic, and deeply psychological. Khomeini wasn't just a leader, he was the architect of a new world. But was it a world of freedom or one of greater tyranny? The Iranian Revolution wasn't the victory of the people. It was the triumph of a new system of control. The Shah was gone, but the people's thirst for retribution was only beginning. Khomeini didn't just lead the revolution. He engineered it, he crafted it, and he used the Shah's mistakes to create a new regime that would rule Iran for decades. The fall of the Shah, from deified ruler to exiled king, 1979. In 1979, the Shah didn't just lose his crown, he lost the very empire he had built. But was it a failure of leadership? Or did he simply realize too late that his entire kingdom was a house of cards waiting to fall? The Shah believed his empire was invincible. But what if I told you his biggest mistake was not just underestimating his own people, but underestimating the very people who had propped him up for decades? The Shah's fall wasn't a sudden rebellion. It was a long, drawn-out process of self-destruction. For years, he had been shackled by his dependence on Western powers, cutting ties with the very essence of Iranian identity. He pushed forward with reforms that suited the West, but alienated the heart of Iran, the rural poor, the religious classes, the intellectuals. His modernization wasn't about Iran's prosperity. It was about ensuring Iran remained a puppet for Western control. The Shah's belief in his own invincibility blinded him to the growing unrest within his own people. His biggest mistake wasn't just the White Revolution. It was alienating those he ruled, believing that no one would dare challenge him. And by the time the revolution came, it wasn't a surprise. It was an inevitability. But what if the Shah had realized the cracks in his empire? Could he have survived the revolution? Or was the end of his reign sealed by his own political miscalculations and the West's betrayal? While the Shah clung to his power, the real mastermind waited in exile. Khomeini didn't just seize the revolution, he orchestrated it from afar. But how did one man, exiled for 14 years, become the leader of a nation that had been ruled by the Shah's iron fist for decades? Khomeini didn't just wait for a moment of weakness in the Shah's regime. He studied it, waited for the right moment to strike. He understood that revolutions aren't about ideology, they're about timing. And Khomeini had the patience to wait for the Shah's biggest failure, his belief that Iran's people would never rise against him. While Khomeini's return in 1979 was seen as a victory, it was years in the making. Khomeini knew that once the Shah lost the support of his people, the monarchy would crumble in days. Khomeini didn't just see the revolution as a political necessity, He saw it as the inevitable reaction to the Shah's failure to rule by anything other than fear. Khomeini knew the Shah's greatest weapon was also his greatest weakness, his need for control. What if Khomeini had failed to rally the masses? Would the Shah have survived? Or was the revolution truly unstoppable by the time Khomeini entered the picture? The Shah's final days were marked by desperation and confusion. Was he a coward? Or did he simply understand too late that his empire had already collapsed? In the final moments of his reign, the Shah was forced to confront a reality he had long ignored. His allies, once loyal to his cause, had already abandoned him. The military, once his stronghold, stood by as the revolution turned into an unstoppable tide. Even the West, which had propped up his regime for so long, had turned its back. The Shah was no longer a ruler. He was a relic of a dying empire. The Shah, once seen as the savior of Iran, was now pleading for another chance. Was he simply trying to buy time? Or was he truly realizing that there was nothing left to save? His empire had already fallen. He just hadn't admitted it yet. But the real question isn't whether the Shah could have saved himself. It's whether his fall was inevitable. Was the Shah doomed the moment he became too reliant on foreign powers? The revolution didn't end when the Shah fled Iran. It marked the beginning of a new, far more dangerous power dynamic. But was Khomeini's return a moment of liberation or the rise of another form of tyranny? Khomeini's return wasn't just a political victory, it was the beginning of a new era, one that would shape not just Iran, but the entire Middle East. But was Khomeini truly a savior, or was he just another ruler, hungry for power, using the revolution as his tool? Khomeini's rise marked the end of an empire. But what was it the beginning of? Was Khomeini's Islamic Republic a return to justice and fairness? Or the rise of a new kind of totalitarian rule, one rooted in religious doctrine instead of secular power? The Shah's downfall wasn't just the collapse of a regime. It was the birth of a new reality, one that the people of Iran weren't prepared for. Khomeini's revolution may have toppled the Shah, but what did the Iranian people truly gain? A new ruler, or a new form of oppression? The revolution was supposed to be the end of the Shah's tyranny, but in the aftermath, it wasn't just a monarchy that fell. It was the hope of a nation that could never return to what it once was. The revolution brought change, but not the kind Iran had imagined. In 1979, the Shah didn't just lose a throne. He lost the very country he thought he had built. But what if the real reason the Shah fell wasn't because of the revolution, but because of his own arrogance? What if the true force behind Khomeini's rise wasn't just a religious movement, but the destruction of the Shah's greatest mistake, his belief in invincibility? The Shah's empire didn't collapse overnight. It crumbled piece by piece until only a fragile, desperate man remained, begging for redemption. But by then, the game was already over. The Shah believed that his power was unassailable. But the truth was, he never understood that his strength lay in the loyalty of his people, not in his lavish palaces or his dependence on foreign backing. His greatest mistake wasn't just the repression of opposition. It was his complete disregard for the cultural forces that were brewing underneath his shiny, westernized regime. The Shah was a monarch who embraced modernity, but misunderstood Iran's complex cultural landscape. He alienated not just the religious classes, but the rural populations, the working poor, and even many intellectuals who saw the Shah's modernization as a betrayal of Iran's traditions and values. His reign was built on a shaky foundation, one that was bound to fracture as soon as his people found their voice. The Shah's regime wasn't just rejected for its political failures, it was rejected for the cultural erosion it represented. The Shah's obsession with Western-style reforms wasn't just politically naive, it was culturally catastrophic. Iran's identity wasn't built in his image. It was the product of millennia of history, tradition, and religion. His failure to respect this deep well of Iranian identity made him an enemy of his own people. But what was the real turning point in the Shah's downfall? What moment marked the shift from a king in control to a man trapped in a collapsing empire? Khomeini didn't just wait for the revolution to come. He designed it from exile. While the Shah sat in his palaces, surrounded by the comforts of Western powers, Khomeini was building a movement that would take root not in the streets, but in the minds and hearts of the Iranian people. His rise was the product of an ideology, yes, but more importantly, it was the product of timing and patience. Khomeini understood something the Shah never did. Revolutions are won through psychological warfare. The people didn't just revolt because of political oppression. They revolted because they were finally given an ideological reason to reject everything the Shah represented. While the Shah thought he was fighting communism and religious extremism, Khomeini used the religious and economic discontent to craft a narrative of moral redemption, a narrative that would resonate far beyond the religious elite. Khomeini's true genius was in his manipulation of ideological purity. He didn't just promise change, he promised a return to an idealized version of Iran where religion would replace secularism and the Iranian identity would be restored. His revolution wasn't just political, it was a cultural, ideological revolution that went to the very core of what it meant to be Iranian. But how did Khomeini manage to manipulate such a wide range of people, from the intellectuals to the poor to the religious? How did he craft a movement that was more than just opposition to the Shah? It was the creation of a new identity for Iran. In his final moments, the Shah didn't just lose a throne. He lost everything that defined him. The very sense of invulnerability that had once made him the symbol of Iranian power became his greatest weakness. As the revolution gained momentum, the Shah didn't just face opposition, he faced the unraveling of his own identity. The Shah's obsession with his image, his ego-driven belief in his unassailable power, blinded him to the cracks in his empire. By the time the people revolted, he wasn't just fighting a political enemy. He was fighting the inevitable collapse of the identity he had built for himself. Khomeini's revolution wasn't just a physical overthrow. It was the ideological destruction of everything the Shah stood for. The Shah's plea for mercy wasn't just a political, last-ditch effort. It was the desperate cry of a man who had always believed he was untouchable, only to realize too late that the very system he had built was crumbling beneath his feet. The Shah wasn't just dethroned, he was unmade as a man, as a leader, and as a symbol of power. But the true tragedy wasn't just that the Shah fell. It was that he never understood the true nature of the forces that had built and destroyed him. Could the Shah have prevented his fall? Or was he doomed by his own creation, the illusion of an empire that was never as solid as he thought? Khomeini's return was the moment of his ultimate victory. But what did that victory truly mean for Iran? Was Khomeini's revolution a triumph of the people or a new form of religious tyranny? Khomeini didn't just overthrow the Shah, he completely reshaped Iran's political landscape. The Iranian Revolution wasn't about returning to the past. It was about reinventing the future. And Khomeini's Iran was a future where religious governance was the cornerstone of political life. But while Khomeini promised a return to Iran's roots, he also promised a system of governance where the people's freedoms would be dictated by religious law. This wasn't a simple revolution. It was the creation of a new kind of tyranny, one cloaked in the ideal of religious purity. Khomeini's Islamic Republic wasn't the victory of the Iranian people. It was the establishment of a regime that would replace one form of oppression with another. The Shah's regime was secular, but Khomeini's was religious. In the end, Iran traded one kind of authoritarian rule for another. What Khomeini delivered wasn't just revolution, it was the institutionalization of religious control with consequences that are still being felt today. Could Iran have escaped Khomeini's vision? Was it possible for the revolution to have taken another path? Or was Khomeini's rise inevitable once the Shah's regime had fallen? Khomeini's revolution may have toppled the Shah, but the true cost of that victory has yet to be fully understood. While the Iranian people rose against an oppressive regime, they unwittingly replaced one form of authoritarian rule with another. The Iranian Revolution was not the triumph of democracy, it was the establishment of a theocratic system that would forever alter the nation's course. In the end, the revolution's true winner wasn't the people, it was Khomeini's ideological purity, a purity that reshaped Iran's identity, politics, and future. The Shah may have fallen, but Iran's freedom was sacrificed on the altar of revolution. In 1979, the Shah of Iran didn't just lose his throne, he lost his legacy, his identity, and his very place in history. But was his fall inevitable, or did the West abandon him at the worst possible moment? And what if the revolution wasn't about overthrowing a monarch, but about constructing an entirely new ideological empire that would challenge the world? When the Shah fled Iran, he thought it was the end of a chapter, but in reality, it was the beginning of a new, far more dangerous reality, one forged in the minds of the oppressed. The Shah believed that Iran was his empire to shape as he saw fit. But what if his real mistake wasn't his policies, but his refusal to acknowledge the cultural and religious undercurrents that were quietly, but forcefully eroding his power? The Shah's greatest failure wasn't just in attempting to modernize Iran too rapidly. It was in misunderstanding Iran's soul. His reforms were sold as progressive and modern, but they ignored the centuries-old traditions that had always defined the Iranian identity. The Shah sought to reshape the nation in the image of the West, but in doing so, he alienated the very core of Iranian society, the religious establishment, the rural poor, and even intellectuals who saw the Shah's reforms as an attack on Iran's cultural fabric. The Shah's dependence on Western support wasn't just political, it was psychological. He believed that by aligning with the West, he would cement his rule. But in reality, his relationship with foreign powers was always transactional, never rooted in true mutual loyalty. When push came to shove, they abandoned him, and he was left isolated, clinging to a throne he no longer controlled. What if the Shah had taken a different approach? What if he had embraced the deep cultural and religious roots of Iran instead of forcing an alien modernity on his people? Would his regime have survived, or was he already doomed by his overconfidence? Khomeini wasn't just an opposition leader, he was a master of psychological warfare. But while the Shah tried to crush dissent, Khomeini was cultivating it, not just as a response to tyranny, but as a strategic project to reshape Iran's future. Khomeini didn't just take advantage of the Shah's weaknesses, he exploited them. By carefully crafting an ideological movement that combined religious fervor with political strategy, Khomeini turned the revolution into a moral crusade that transcended political affiliations. His message wasn't just about replacing one ruler with another. It was about creating a new Iran, one where religion governed everything, from politics to culture. But Khomeini's rise wasn't a spontaneous reaction. It was a long-term, patient cultivation of power through religious and political maneuvering. Khomeini's exile in France wasn't a setback. It was his greatest strength. While the Shah believed his power was secure, Khomeini was building an intellectual and political movement that would gain momentum, not just among the religious elite, but also among intellectuals, students, and even disillusioned secularists who saw in Khomeini a leader who could restore Iran's dignity and moral order. By the time Khomeini returned to Iran, he didn't just have followers, he had an army of people ready to tear down the old order. But how did Khomeini manage to unite such a diverse array of groups, from devout clerics to secular revolutionaries? And how did he turn the Shah's repression into a springboard for his own rise to power? Was the Shah's fall the result of a single revolution? Or was it the inevitable collapse of a system that had been crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions for years? As Khomeini's revolution gained momentum, the Shah watched helplessly from exile, trying to hold on to a regime that no longer had any credibility or support. His final moments weren't just filled with regret. They were filled with the devastating realization that his greatest miscalculation was failing to see the inevitability of his downfall. The Shah had built his power on the illusion of control, on the belief that by consolidating power with the West, he could avoid the very cultural and social forces that were pulling his empire apart. The Shah's ultimate betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. He had betrayed the very soul of Iran, trading its identity for Western approval. And in the end, that betrayal was the foundation of his undoing. The people didn't just rise against him because of his policies, they rose against him because they realized they had been sold out to the highest bidder. Could the Shah have prevented his fall if he had been more attuned to his people's needs? Or was his reliance on the West and his inability to adapt to Iran's changing political landscape the fatal flaw that sealed his fate? Khomeini's victory was not just the overthrow of the Shah, it was the creation of a new world order, one where religion would reign supreme over politics. But was Khomeini's rise a victory for the people, or the beginning of a new form of control that would replace one tyranny with another? The creation of the Islamic Republic wasn't just a political shift, it was a radical restructuring of Iranian identity. Khomeini's rule wasn't about ending the Shah's tyranny, it was about instituting a new form of ideological governance, one where religious purity, not political freedom, was the guiding principle. Khomeini didn't just dismantle the monarchy, he created a new theocratic system, one that has ruled Iran ever since. The question now is, what did the revolution actually achieve? Did it free the people, or just replace one form of oppression with another? The Iranian Revolution promised freedom and justice, but under Khomeini, Iran quickly descended into a system of religious rule that placed ultimate power in the hands of the clergy. The revolution that had begun as a movement for freedom soon became a tool for enforcing ideological purity, with devastating consequences for the rights and freedoms of the Iranian people. Was Khomeini's vision of an Islamic Republic truly the answer to Iran's problems? Or did it just create new chains, this time shackled by religious dogma? Khomeini didn't just defeat the Shah, he reshaped Iran's very identity, creating a regime that, while different from the monarchy, has become a force in global politics for decades. The revolution may have toppled the Shah, but the legacy of that revolution is a complex, painful one that continues to define Iran to this day. The Shah may have lost his throne, but the people of Iran paid a high price for Khomeini's victory. The revolution that promised freedom became the foundation of an oppressive regime. In the end, the true cost of the revolution wasn't just the fall of a king, it was the rise of a new form of tyranny, one that would haunt Iran's future for generations. Thank you to everyone who watched this video all the way through. Your thoughts and feedback are greatly appreciated. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to dive deeper into history's most defining moments. Like and share this video with your family and friends. The truth is out there. Are you ready to uncover it?